A single sentence, spoken in a room dripping with diamonds and ambition, can cost a man a billion-dollar empire. It wasn't a stock market crash or a failed merger that brought Nathaniel Caldwell to his knees. It was a toast. A cruel, casual toast he made in front of his mistress, aimed directly at the woman who had built everything he had, his billionaire wife Genevieve Beaumont. He thought it was a power move, a joke among friends. He didn't realize it was a declaration of war. And in a war against Genevieve, there is only ever one winner. The Beaumont-Caldwell union was to the outside world the pinnacle of New York high society. It was a merger of old-world charm and new-world power. Genevieve Beaumont was the power, a prodigy who had turned a modest inheritance into Beaumont Global, a sprawling conglomerate with tentacles in sustainable technology, international real estate, and private equity. Her face was a regular feature in Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal always accompanied by headlines that used words like visionary, titan, and uncompromising. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that belied the razor-sharp intellect constantly at work. Her smile was rare, but when it appeared it could light up a boardroom or disarm a hostile negotiator. Nathaniel "Nate" Caldwell was the charm. He was handsome in that effortless country club way, with a pedigree that opened doors Genevieve's money had to knock on first. They met at a fundraiser a decade ago. She was captivated by his easy laughter and the way he seemed utterly unintimidated by her success. He in turn was swept away by her quiet intensity and brilliance. In the early years, he was her confidant, her social ambassador, the one who smoothed the ruffled feathers of the old money establishment she was disrupting. But time and a 9-figure bank account you didn't earn can curdle a man's character. The laughter became tinged with arrogance. The confidence morphed into entitlement. Genevieve had made him the CEO of the Beaumont Lifestyle Division, a prestigious but relatively small subsidiary, dealing in luxury properties and high-end hospitality. It was in essence a gilded playpen she had created to give him a sense of purpose. He was good at it, hosting lavish parties, networking with potential clients, and being the handsome face of the brand. He was a phenomenal salesman. The problem was he had started to believe he was the architect. The cracks in their marriage weren't chasms yet, but fine hairline fractures. They were there in the way he'd talk over her in meetings with architects, only to repeat her own ideas minutes later. They were there in the separate flights back from business trips, his excuse always being a networking golf game in Palm Beach or Scottsdale. Genevieve, a woman who could detect a lie in a quarterly earnings report from a mile away, saw it all. She saw the receipts from jewelers she didn't shop at, and the late-night texts that were hastily deleted. She chose for a time to ignore them, not out of weakness, but out of a calculated sense of loss management. Their marriage was a brand. A messy divorce would be a distraction, a vulnerability her competitors like the notoriously predatory Silas Kane of Kane Industries would exploit in a heartbeat. She treated Nate's infidelities like a correctable market fluctuation, unpleasant, but manageable. She believed, perhaps naively, that his vanity had a ceiling. She was about to find out it did not. The catalyst for the implosion had a name: Kiera Monroe. She was a 20-something architectural designer with ambition that burned like a wildfire. She was sharp, beautiful, and utterly ruthless. She attached herself to Nate at an art gallery opening, flattering his ego and making him feel like the titan he pretended to be, not the well-compensated figurehead he was. To Kiera, Nate wasn't a man. He was a door with the name Beaumont written on it in solid gold, and she was determined to kick it down. Nate was intoxicated by her. She was everything his life with Genevieve wasn't. Where Genevieve was strategy, Kiera was spontaneity. Where Genevieve demanded substance, Kiera celebrated style. He began bringing her to business lunches, introducing her as his protégée. The old guard in the company saw her for what she was and kept their distance. But Nate, blinded by his own reflection in her admiring eyes, saw only validation. He was about to make the gravest miscalculation of his life, confusing his wife's strategic patience for weakness. The launch party for the Elysian Towers Dubai was the crown jewel of the Beaumont Lifestyle Division. It was Nate's magnum opus, a project he had overseen from the initial designs. In reality, Genevieve's core team had structured the financing, negotiated the land deals with the Emirati government, and handled the complex logistics. Nate's primary role was to approve the marble finishes and host this very party. The event was held at the Celeste, a new hyper-exclusive club overlooking Central Park. The air was thick with the scent of money, perfume, and ambition. Tech billionaires mingled with real estate moguls, and European aristocrats chatted with Broadway producers. Genevieve was in her element, moving through the crowd with practiced ease, her silver gown shimmering under the soft lights. She was closing a quiet side deal with a Japanese investor, her conversation a low, precise murmur. Nate, meanwhile, was holding court at the main bar, a glass of vintage Macallan in his hand. Kiera Monroe was practically fused to his side, her red dress a slash of scarlet against his tailored tuxedo. He was louder than usual, his laughter booming across the room. He felt untouchable, the king of his castle, forgetting who had built the fortress and signed the deed. The speeches began. The project director gave a polished presentation. The lead architect spoke about vision. Then it was Nate's turn. He swaggered to the small stage, basking in the applause. He spoke eloquently about luxury, about aspiration, about the future of global living. He thanked his team, the investors, the city of Dubai. Genevieve watched him from her table, a neutral expression on her face. This was Nate at his best, charming and persuasive. Then he went off script. "And I want to give one final special thank you," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd, deliberately skipping over Genevieve and landing squarely on Kiera. He raised his glass. "To inspiration, to the muses who fan the flames of creativity." A nervous ripple went through the room. People who knew the couple exchanged uneasy glances. Arthur Finch, Genevieve's long-serving general counsel, stiffened in his chair. Nate smirked, a cruel, self-satisfied curl of his lip. He looked toward his wife's table, not at her, but at the people sitting with her, as if sharing an inside joke. They say behind every great man is a great woman, but sometimes the real genius is in knowing when to upgrade the foundation you're building on. He winked a gesture of colossal stupidity directly at Kiera, who preened under the attention. He then raised his glass higher. "To my wife, Genevieve," he said, the words dripping with condescending patronage, "for providing the capital, the initial sturdy and, let's be honest, somewhat boring foundation. And to Kiera," he said, turning his body fully toward his mistress, his voice now filled with a syrupy warmth, "for providing the architectural vision and the passion that truly brought this project to life, to the foundation and to the skyscraper." The silence was deafening. It was a solid physical thing pressing down on the 200 obscenely wealthy people in the room. It wasn't just an affair being aired out. It was a public declaration of disrespect, so profound it was breathtaking. He hadn't just acknowledged his mistress. He had belittled his wife's entire contribution to her own company, reducing her to a walking bank account. He had mocked the very woman who owned the air he was breathing. Every eye in the room swiveled to Genevieve. They expected tears, a shouted retort, a storm of fury. They got nothing. Genevieve Beaumont sat perfectly still. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. Her expression didn't change by a single flicker of a muscle. She simply held Nate's gaze from across the room. Then she did two things. First, she took a slow, deliberate sip of her water. Second, she gave him the smallest, most imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of agreement or forgiveness. It was a nod of acknowledgement, a nod that said, "Message received," and understood. Then she rose from her chair with unnerving calm, placed her napkin on the table and walked out of the room. The quiet click of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound, each step an echo of a hammer falling on a gavel, passing a sentence Nate was too arrogant to hear. The ride home in the custom soundproofed Maybach was an exercise in pure tension. Nate, his alcohol-fueled bravado, now evaporating into a clammy sweat of anxiety, stumbled into the car after her. He had expected a scene at the party, a dramatic confrontation. Her silent exit was infinitely more terrifying. "Jen, listen," he began, his voice raspy. It didn't come out right. The guys we were just joking around earlier and—" Genevieve didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the blur of city lights. Her stillness was absolute, like a predator waiting for its prey to make a final fatal move. "It was a toast, for God's sake," Nate pressed on his voice, rising in panic. "A stupid drunken toast. Kiera means nothing. You know that. She's just an ambitious kid." The silence from her side of the car was a wall of ice. He could feel the temperature dropping. "Say something," he finally pleaded, his charm utterly useless. "Yell at me, throw something, do what you always do, just say something." Genevieve finally turned her head. Her eyes, usually a warm, intelligent grey, were now the colour of slate, cold and hard. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time he didn't see a wife. He saw a CEO evaluating a toxic asset. "I have nothing to say to you, Nathaniel," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice she used when informing a subordinate their position had been eliminated. "Everything you needed to say, you said tonight. In front of my investors, my board members, and my competitors. You were very clear." She turned back to the window, and that was it. The conversation was over. They drove the remaining 20 minutes to their palatial Upper East Side penthouse in absolute silence. When they arrived, she walked out of the elevator and went straight to her private study, the one room in the house that was hers alone. Nate heard the heavy oak door click shut, followed by the distinct sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. He stood in the cavernous marble foyer, the silence of the massive apartment amplifying his dread. He had made a mistake, a terrible, terrible mistake, but he still believed it was a marital problem, something that could be fixed with an expensive apology gift and a few weeks of feigned contrition. He thought he had broken a rule of their marriage. He didn't understand that he had just violated the core principle of her business, never ever threatened the stability of the Beaumont global brand. Inside her study, Genevieve wasn't crying. She wasn't throwing things. She sat behind her enormous desk, the skyline of Manhattan glittering behind her like a kingdom she had conquered. For a moment, she allowed herself a single deep breath. The betrayal was a physical pain, a cold blade twisting in her gut. The decade of her life, the genuine affection she once had for him, the partnership she thought they'd built, all of it, incinerated in a single public act of humiliation. But emotion was a luxury, and she had work to do. She pressed a button on her secure intercom. "Arthur, are you still awake?" The voice of Arthur Finch, her lawyer and confidant for 15 years, came back instantly crisp and alert. "Of course, Genevieve. I've been waiting for your call. I'm looking at the guest list from tonight. Silas Kane was at the next table. He heard every word." "I know," Genevieve said, her voice steady. I saw the look on his face. "He smells blood in the water." "What are your orders?" Arthur asked. There was no judgment, no. "I told you so. Just readiness." Genevieve swiveled in her chair to face the window, looking down at the city she owned. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "Arthur," she said, "I want you to activate Clause 17B in my marital agreement with Nathaniel, the gross misconduct and public brand disparagement clause. And I want you to draw up the paperwork to invoke the key person provision in the charter for the lifestyle division. Effective immediately, I am relieving him of all duties and responsibilities. Change the security codes at the office. Revoke his access to all company accounts, servers, and properties." There was a brief pause on the other end. "All of them," Arthur confirmed. "The corporate cards, the jet, the Aspen house, liquidate his professional existence." "Arthur," Genevieve commanded, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. "I want him to wake up next Monday and discover that the only thing he owns is the suit on his back and the watch on his wrist. Everything else belongs to the company. To my company." "Consider it done," Arthur said. "I'll have the preliminary notices drafted by sunrise." "Good," Genevieve replied. She ended the call and stood up, walking to the vast window. She looked down at the streams of headlights, a complex network of individual journeys, all moving according to a set of rules. For 10 years, she had allowed Nate to ride in her lane, to draft in her wake. He had forgotten he was a passenger, not the driver. Now the driver was taking the next exit, and she was leaving him stranded on the side of the highway. The storm wasn't coming. The storm had already arrived. The week that followed was a masterclass in silent corporate warfare, orchestrated by a woman who had forgotten more about strategy than Nate Caldwell had ever known. While Nate spent the weekend nursing a hangover and composing pathetic rambling apology texts that went unanswered, Genevieve and her inner circle were moving with the swift, brutal efficiency of a special operations team. Her study, which Nate had always mockingly called the throne room, became a war room. Arthur Finch, a man whose loyalty to Genevieve was absolute, was a permanent fixture. He arrived Saturday morning with 2 junior associates and a mountain of files, his face grim and determined. "The marital agreement is ironclad, Genevieve," he explained, spreading documents across the polished mahogany desk. "Clause 17B is unambiguous. Any action, public or private, by either party that brings the Beaumont Global brand or its principal officer into disrepute or public ridicule constitutes a material breach." His speech tonight was a textbook violation. It gives you full authority to financially separate his personal holdings from the corporate assets he was managing. He thinks his shares are his... Genevieve said, her voice clinical, as she scanned a document. "They are performance-based shares held in a corporate trust that you control," Arthur corrected. "His performance has just been terminated. With cause. He has no voting rights and no claim to them upon termination for breach." Nate had never read the fine print. He had been too busy enjoying the perks. The plan was multi-pronged, designed not just to remove him, but to erase him from the corporate structure, so completely it would be as if he were never there. Phase 1, the severance. This was the legal and financial decapitation. Arthur's team worked through the weekend. On Monday morning, at precisely 9:01 a.m., a volley of emails was unleashed. The first went to the board of directors of Beaumont Global, officially notifying them that Nathaniel Caldwell's contract as CEO of the lifestyle division was terminated effective immediately pending a formal review. The notice, drafted by Genevieve herself, cited a fundamental misalignment of strategic values and a breach of his fiduciary duties. The second went to the heads of finance and IT. It was a simple direct order: revoke all access. Corporate credit cards, including his cherished Black Amex, were cancelled. His company email account calendar and server access were deactivated. His key card for the Beaumont Tower was disabled. The third went to the teams managing corporate assets. The pilots of the company's Gulfstream GX50 were instructed that Nathaniel Caldwell was no longer an authorized passenger. The staff at the company-owned properties in Aspen, St. Bart's, and Lake Como were informed of the same. Phase 2. The containment. Genevieve knew that a move this sudden would create ripples. She needed to control the narrative before Nate could spin his own version of events. She personally called 3 of the most powerful members of her board, giving them a brief, sanitized version of the incident, framing it as the culmination of a long period of professional recklessness on Nate's part. She presented it not as a personal betrayal, but as a necessary business decision to protect shareholder value. They being shrewd. Business people who respected her far more than her husband offered their unwavering support. She then had her head of communications, a sharp woman named Alani, draft an internal memo. It was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, announcing a bold new strategic realignment for the lifestyle division. It mentioned streamlining leadership and leveraging synergies with the core brand. Nate's name was conspicuously absent. He wasn't fired, he was simply edited out of the future. Phase 3. The coup de grace. This was the most brutal part of the plan, and the one that showed the depths of Genevieve's strategic mind. The Elysian Towers Dubai project was Nate's baby. His name was all over it. Genevieve knew that simply taking it away from him wasn't enough. She had to dismantle his legacy. On Wednesday, she convened a meeting with the project's lead investors, the same ones who had witnessed Nate's humiliating toast. She didn't mention the toast. Instead, she presented a new projection, a detailed analysis showing how Nate's focus on extravagant, high-cost finishes and vanity features had inflated the budget by 18%, significantly cutting into their projected returns. Nathaniel's vision was ambitious, she said calmly, but my primary duty is to you, our partners. Beaumont Global is and always will be ROI-driven. I have commissioned a new architectural review to optimize the project for profitability and long-term value. Then came the masterstroke. She announced she was bringing in a new design consultant to lead the review, a name that was whispered in awe in architectural circles, a Pritzker Prize winner, known for his profitable minimalist aesthetic. It was a move so decisive, so powerfully forward-thinking, that it made Nate's leadership look amateurish and self-indulgent by comparison. The investors were practically giddy. And what about Kiera Monroe, the architectural vision from Nate's toast? Genevieve dealt with her through a single, devastatingly effective channel. She had Arthur Finch send a cease and desist letter to the small firm Kiera worked for. It noted that Ms. Monroe had been present at confidential project meetings without a non-disclosure agreement in place, and that any attempt to claim credit for or publicly associate with the Elysian Towers project would be met with swift legal action for intellectual property infringement. Kiera's firm terrified of getting into a legal war with Beaumont. Global immediately put her on leave and took her name off their website. Her door hadn't just been slammed shut, it had been bricked over. By the end of the week, Genevieve had surgically excised Nate from every facet of the empire she had built. His professional identity, his perks, his projects, his future, all of it had been repossessed. He just didn't know it yet. He was still living in their penthouse, leaving contrite voicemails and planning how he would win her back, completely oblivious to the fact that he was already a ghost in the machine. Nate Caldwell woke up on Monday morning, exactly 1 week after the party, feeling a sliver of optimism. Genevieve had been silent for 7 days, but she hadn't kicked him out of the house. He took this as a sign that her anger was cooling. He believed he was still in the penalty box of a marital spat, not realizing he'd been ejected from the entire sport. He put on one of his favorite bespoke suits, ready to go to the office and begin his campaign of apology and reconciliation. He'd start by sending an outrageously expensive floral arrangement to her office, the kind that requires its own security detail. The first sign that the world had tilted on its axis was small. He went to use his corporate Amex to pay for the Uber to Beaumont Tower. Card declined. He frowned, irritated. He tried a second corporate card. Card declined. Annoyed, assuming it was a fraud alert, he paid with his personal card and thought nothing more of it. When he arrived at the gleaming obsidian facade of Beaumont Tower, he strode confidently toward the executive security checkpoint. He swiped his keycard. The light flashed red. Access denied. He swiped it again. Red. A security guard, a man named George, whom Nate had known for years, stepped forward, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Caldwell, sir, I'm afraid your access has been suspended." Suspended? What are you talking about, George? It's a glitch in the system. Just let me through, Nate said with a dismissive wave. I can't do that, sir. George said, his voice firm but apologetic. My instructions are clear. You'll need to contact HR. Humiliation pricked at Nate's skin. He stepped aside, fumbling for his phone to call his assistant, only to realize he couldn't access his corporate contacts. He tried to log into his company email. Password incorrect. He tried to reset it. This user account does not exist. Panic, cold and sharp, began to seep into his veins. He called the main office line and asked for his own extension. I'm sorry, the operator said politely. We have no one by that name in our directory. It was like the world was gaslighting him. He hailed a taxi and raced back to the penthouse, his mind reeling. He needed to talk to Genevieve to figure out what kind of sick game this was. But when he arrived, the doorman, a man who had greeted him by name every day for 8 years, stopped him. I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell. I can't let you up. What are you talking about, Robert? I live here. Nate sputtered, his voice cracking. Robert looked down at a memo on his desk. My instructions from Ms. Beaumont's office are that you are no longer a resident. Your personal effects have been packed and are being delivered to a storage facility. The address has been sent to your personal email. Nate stood on the marble floor of the lobby, completely dumbfounded. It was happening. It was actually happening. This wasn't a game. This was an eviction. Desperate, he called Kiera. He needed an ally, someone to tell him he wasn't going crazy. Nate, her voice was clipped, nervous. Kiera, you won't believe what's happening. Jen has lost her mind. She's locked me out of the office, the house, everything. It's insane. Nate, I can't talk, she whispered hurriedly. My firm. They got a letter from Beaumont's lawyers. They're threatening to sue me if I even mention the Dubai project. I'm on leave. They might fire me. What, she's coming after you too? This is a vendetta, he yelled into the phone. This is your mess, Nate. Kiera hissed, her voice, shedding its usual layer of seductive charm to reveal the raw, panicked ambition beneath. You were supposed to be a partner, a player. You're just her glorified husband. You poked the dragon, and now you're surprised you got burned. Don't call me again. I have my own career to save. The line went dead. Nate stood on the sidewalk of Park Avenue, the city's frantic energy swirling around him. In the space of an hour, he had lost his job, his home, his access, his mistress, and his identity. He looked up at the penthouse, a glass palace in the sky, where Genevieve was at that very moment likely signing the documents that were systematically erasing him from existence. He had thought the toast was a power play. He finally understood that it was suicide, and Genevieve Beaumont wasn't the type to stop a man from destroying himself. She was the type to hand him a more efficient weapon. If Nate thought his Monday was bad, the rest of the week was designed to teach him the true meaning of the word pariah. Genevieve's strategy was not just to defeat him, but to annihilate his reputation so thoroughly that he would have no ground upon which to rebuild. The first public shot was fired on Tuesday in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. Genevieve had granted a rare, exclusive interview to their top business columnist. The article titled, "Beaumont's New Vision, Profitability Over Prestige," was a surgical strike. In it, Genevieve spoke passionately about her company's future, about sustainable growth and fiscal responsibility. When asked about the leadership changes in the lifestyle division, her answer was chilling in its corporate politeness. "We've undergone a strategic realignment," she said, her photo accompanying the article, showing her looking poised and powerful. The previous leadership fostered a culture of extravagance that, while glamorous, was not aligned with the core fiscal discipline of Beaumont Global. "We are builders, not party planners. Our investors expect returns, not headlines in society pages." She had, without ever mentioning his name, publicly branded him an incompetent, spendthrift playboy. She reduced his entire tenure to a flight of fancy that the serious-minded CEO had now corrected. The article was a signal to the entire business community. Nate Caldwell was out. More than that, he was a liability. The phones of the people Nate considered his friends and allies began to go straight to voicemail. Invitations to golf games were rescinded with flimsy excuses. The chairman of a charity board on which Nate sat called him personally. "Nate, my boy," the old man said with false sympathy, "given the restructuring at Beaumont, we think it's best if you step down for a while. To avoid any conflicts, you understand." He was being politely excommunicated from the world he had worked so hard to belong to. The ultimate humiliation, however, was reserved for the Elysian Towers project. Nate learned through a scathing industry blog post that Genevieve had sold a 40% stake in the project, the very stake he had been trying for months to secure funding for to their most hated rival, Silas Kane. The move was strategically brilliant on multiple levels. It immediately injected a massive amount of capital into the project, silencing any rumors of instability. It also put Silas Kane, a ruthless operator, in a position of power over the project's future, ensuring he would have a vested interest in erasing any of Nate's previous influence. But most importantly, it was a deeply personal insult. Kane had been circling for years, and Nate had always boasted that he would never let that shark near a Beaumont property. Now Kane was not just in the water. Genevieve had personally invited him into the boat. Nate, who was now living out of a sterile suite at the Mandarin Oriental that was rapidly depleting his personal savings, read the news on his laptop and felt a wave of nausea. He imagined Genevieve and Silas Kane, two apex predators sitting across a table, shaking hands on a deal that was built on the ashes of his career. He had been a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. He tried to fight back. He hired a lawyer, a flashy litigator known for high-profile divorces. The first meeting was a disaster. The lawyer reviewed the marital and corporate agreements Arthur Finch had couriered over. "There's nothing here, Nate," the lawyer said, tossing the thick binder on his desk with a sigh. "This is the tightest corporate structuring I've ever seen. Every stock option, every asset, every directorship, it's all tied to your employment, which was terminated with cause. The cause being the public disparagement clause you violated. You have nothing. She left you with the prenuptial allowance, and that's it. She can't just take everything, Nate raged. She didn't take anything, the lawyer corrected him bluntly. It was never yours to begin with. You were managing it. You were a steward. And she fired you. You broke the first rule of living in a queen's castle. Don't insult the queen. The reality was crushing. He had no leverage, no allies, and no power. He had been the charming face of the brand, but Genevieve Beaumont was the brand. And the brand had just issued a product recall on him. Stripped of his power, his reputation in tatters, and his bank account dwindling at an alarming rate, Nate was left with only one card to play a direct, desperate appeal. He had to see her to confront her, to make her understand the totality of what she had done. He knew he couldn't get into the penthouse, so he waited. For 2 days he sat in a coffee shop across the street from Beaumont Tower, watching the endless flow of black cars. On the 3rd day, his patience was rewarded. He saw her leaving the building, not in her usual Maybach, but in a smaller, sleeker Audi with only a driver. She was clearly heading somewhere less formal. He jumped in a taxi. "Follow that car," he barked, feeling like a character in a bad movie. The Audi led him not to a restaurant or a gala, but to a quiet, elegant brownstone in the West Village. It was a property he vaguely remembered her buying years ago, an art foundation she sponsored. He saw her get out and go inside. This was his chance. He paid the driver and strode to the door. As he expected, it was locked. He pressed the buzzer for the director's office, and when a voice answered, he simply said, "Delivery for Ms. Beaumont." The lock clicked open. He found her on the 2nd floor in a brightly lit gallery space. She was standing alone in front of a massive abstract canvas, a chaotic swirl of deep blues and violent reds. She wasn't surprised to see him. She must have seen him on the security cameras. She simply turned her expression unreadable. "This is private property, Nathaniel," she said, her voice calm. "I had to see you." He pleaded, his voice raw. "Jen, what you've done, it's biblical. You've destroyed me." "No," she corrected him, her voice as cool and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "You destroyed yourself. I merely processed the paperwork." "For a joke, for one stupid drunken toast," he exclaimed, taking a step closer. "Was it a joke, Nate?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Was it a joke when you devalued my contribution to my own company in front of my investors? Was it a joke when you tried to elevate your mistress by standing on my reputation? You seem to be confused. You thought our marriage was a partnership of equals. It was not. It was a position I offered you, a position with enormous benefits, and one single requirement: loyalty. Not to me, the woman. I am not that naive. But loyalty to the brand, to the foundation. You used my own words against me. The foundation. You spat on it. You spat on this entire enterprise. And for that, there are consequences." Tears of pure rage and frustration welled in his eyes. "So that's it. 10 years gone because I bruised your ego." Genevieve actually laughed, a short, sharp, humorless sound. "My ego, Nathaniel, you still don't get it. This was never about my feelings. This was about a threat assessment. You, in your arrogance, made yourself a threat to the stability of my company. You signaled to my rivals that there was weakness and division in my house. You became a bad investment. And I," she said, taking a step toward him, her quiet intensity making him shrink back, "always divest myself of bad investments. You were a line item, and I deleted you." As if on cue, a man in a sharp suit appeared at the gallery entrance. Nate recognized him as one of Arthur Finch's senior associates. The man was holding a leather folio. "Mr. Caldwell." The lawyer said, his tone professional and detached. "I have your final separation papers. The divorce filings. As per the terms of your marital agreement, Ms. Beaumont will not be seeking any of your personal pre-marital assets, and you are not entitled to any of hers. Please sign here to acknowledge receipt." He held out a pen. Nate stared at the papers, then back at Genevieve. He saw no anger in her eyes, no pain, no love. He saw nothing. He was looking at a stranger, a formidable and terrifying stranger. He had spent a decade living in the warmth of her sun, and had foolishly mistaken the light for his own. Now he was cast out into the cold, and he finally understood how dark it was. Defeated, his shoulders slumped. He took the pen and signed. 3 months later, the name Nathaniel Caldwell was little more than a ghost in the annals of New York society, a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails at gallery openings and charity dinners. He had left New York, taking the modest sum from his prenuptial agreement, and disappearing somewhere in Florida, reportedly trying to get into real estate consulting. Without the Beaumont name behind him, the doors were no longer opening. He was just another charming, handsome man with a failed past. Kiera Monroe's career in New York was over. Branded as a poacher and blacklisted by the city's top firms who feared the reach of Beaumont Global, she moved back to her hometown in Ohio, her ambitions reduced to designing kitchen renovations. And Genevieve Beaumont. She thrived. The sale of the stake in the Elysian Towers to Silas Kane had been a strategic masterpiece. With Kane as a partner, the project was fast-tracked and completed under budget-yielding returns that were 30% higher than originally projected. The business world lauded her for her unsentimental, profit-driven decision-making. She was featured on the cover of Time magazine, not as a billionaire's wife or a society figure, but as one of the most influential business leaders of the decade. The article celebrated her for redefining corporate leadership, praising her decisive action in restructuring her company. Her public humiliation of her husband wasn't framed as a personal revenge. It was lauded as an exemplary case study in decisive corporate governance. She had turned the ashes of her marriage into the foundation of her legacy. One crisp autumn evening, Genevieve was in her study, the one Nate had called the throne room. She was reviewing plans for a new philanthropic initiative, a foundation dedicated to funding female entrepreneurs in the tech sector. Arthur Finch was with her finalizing the legal charter. "The board has approved the initial $50 million endowment," Arthur said, placing a folder on her desk. "It's a strong start." "Make it $100 million, Genevieve said without looking up from the plans. "And I want a mentorship program. I want these women to have access to real-world strategic advice, not just capital." "Of course," Arthur said. He paused for a moment. "Are you all right, Genevieve?" She finally looked up, a faint, genuine smile gracing her lips. It was the first one he had seen in months. She looked out at the glittering expanse of Manhattan, the city lights like scattered diamonds. "I'm better than all right, Arthur," she said, her voice filled with a newfound lightness. "I'm undiluted. For years I was carrying a weight I mistook for a partner. I thought managing his ego was part of the price of success. I was wrong." She turned back to him, her grey eyes clear and focused. "The price of success isn't managing the weaknesses of others. It's having the strength to remove them when they threaten to pull you down." She had not just survived the betrayal. She had leveraged it. She had cut out the diseased part of her life, and the entire organism had become stronger, leaner, and more powerful than ever before. Nathaniel Caldwell had tried to mock her foundation, not realizing that Genevieve Beaumont was not the foundation. She was the architect, the builder, and the entire skyscraper, and her empire was still reaching for the sky. A year is a lifetime in the world Genevieve Beaumont inhabited. It was long enough for a company to be acquired, for a fortune to be made, for a reputation to be cemented in stone. For Genevieve, it had been a year of relentless, focused construction. She stood on the observation deck of the newly opened Beaumont Center for Innovation, a gleaming testament to her vision, funded entirely by the profits from the restructured Elysian Towers project. Below her, the city sprawled a map of her own making. The betrayal of Nathaniel Caldwell was no longer a wound. It was a scar, and like all scars on a warrior, it served as a reminder of a battle won. Her life, once a duet, was now a solo performance, and she found the clarity and control to be intoxicating. Her focus had shifted from mere acquisition to legacy. The Beaumont Center wasn't just an office building. It was an incubator for the next generation of female leaders, the very initiative she had envisioned. She spent her days not in hostile takeovers, but in mentoring sessions with brilliant young women, dissecting their business plans with the same surgical precision she had once used to dismantle her husband's life. She was building an army of Genevieve Beaumonts, seeding the future with her own brand of uncompromising excellence. One afternoon, while reviewing a promising biotech proposal, her assistant, a sharp young woman named Lena, entered her office, a hesitant look on her face. "Ms. Beaumont-Ye," she began, "Arthur Finch is on the line. He said it's a personal matter you should be aware of. It concerns a Mr. Caldwell." Genevieve didn't look up from the document. The name was an echo from another life, distant and faint. "Put him through, Lena." "Genevieve." Arthur's voice was as steady as ever. "Apologies for the interruption. I've just received a call. It was routed through a junior legal aid. It was Nathaniel." Genevieve made a small mark on the proposal with her pen. And what did the ghost of Christmas past want? "Money," Arthur said bluntly. His Florida venture, some sort of high-risk real estate speculation, went bankrupt. Apparently his charm doesn't work as well without the Beaumont letterhead. He's lost everything from the pre-nuptial settlement. He was asking if you might consider a small loan for old times' sake. For the first time, an emotion flickered across Genevieve's face. Not anger, not sadness, but a kind of detached, clinical pity. The man who had stood on a stage and mocked her as a boring foundation was now begging for a few of its stones to survive. The lion had become a mouse, squeaking for crumbs. "What was your response, Arthur?" she asked, her voice perfectly even. "I told his lawyer that Miss Beaumont considers all past accounts to be settled and that any further communication would be considered harassment. I have also taken the liberty of setting up a filter. You will not be troubled by this again." "Good," she said. It was the only word necessary. She looked back at the proposal on her desk, at the face of the young, determined CEO, pictured on the first page. That was her future. Nate was her past. "Thank you, Arthur." She ended the call. The interruption had lasted less than 2 minutes. She had spent more time that morning deciding on the cafeteria's coffee supplier. Nathaniel Caldwell had been reduced to an administrative task, one that was now checked off and filed away forever. Her gaze drifted out the window again. She thought of Nate's toast, the one that had set this all in motion. To the foundation and to the skyscraper. He had been wrong. A foundation and a skyscraper are not two separate things. They are one. One cannot exist without the other. He had tried to divorce them, to praise one while belittling the other, and in doing so had revealed he understood nothing about how to build something that lasts. She had been the foundation, and she had become the skyscraper. And from this, high up the ground, where the broken pieces of her past lay, was too far away to even see. Genevieve Beaumont picked up her pen and went back to work, building higher. 5 years is an eternity. It is long enough for new skyscrapers to redraw the skyline, for alliances to be forged and forgotten, and for echoes to finally fade into silence. Genevieve Beaumont stood in the heart of what was once a small private art foundation. Now it was the Beaumont Gallery, a private museum she had acquired and curated herself. It was her sanctuary, a silent testament to the beauty and order she had imposed on her world. She was standing before the same painting, the vast chaotic swirl of deep blues and violent reds that had served as the backdrop for her final severing conversation with Nathaniel. She no longer saw chaos in its strokes. She saw energy. She saw the untamed force of creation, the brutal beauty of disruption. It no longer reminded her of an ending, but of the immense power required to begin again. The 5 years since she had last heard Nate's name had been transformative. The Beaumont Center for Innovation was a global success story. The women she had mentored were now titans in their own right, their companies disrupting industries from biotech to quantum computing. They were her legacy, a network of power and loyalty built not on hollow sentiment, but on shared intellect and mutual respect. Her empire was no longer just a financial entity. It was a dynasty of thought. Arthur Finch, his hair now more silver than black, but his eyes as sharp as ever, walked quietly to her side. He wasn't just her lawyer anymore. He was the chairman of her philanthropic trust and her closest confidant. Theirs was a partnership forged in the crucible of 1,000 battles, a seamless trust that required few words. The board approved the expansion into the Asian market, he said, softly standing beside her. The first class of the Singapore incubator starts next month. Excellent, Genevieve replied, her eyes still on the canvas. Ensure the selection criteria are rigorous. I want builders, not dreamers. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Arthur glanced from the painting to her face, a knowing look in his eyes. It's been a long time, he said, his meaning clear. Time is a business asset, Arthur. She responded, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. You invest it, you leverage it, or you lose it. I chose to invest. And the return, he asked. She finally turned from the painting to look at him, her gaze clear and serene. Peace and progress. There was no bitterness left, no lingering anger. The story of Nathaniel Caldwell was now just a case study she would occasionally and anonymously use when teaching her mentees about the importance of vetting a partner, whether in business or in life. His name was a footnote in a chapter she had long since finished reading. After Arthur left, Genevieve remained. She thought about the woman she was a decade ago, the one who had mistaken charm for character, the one who had tolerated infidelity as a manageable market fluctuation. She did not mourn that woman, nor did she scorn her. She simply acknowledged her as the foundation, a necessary, if flawed, starting point. A person, she mused, is like a company. You have your core assets, your liabilities, your acquisitions, and your divestitures. Nate had been a spectacular divestiture, a toxic asset whose removal had unlocked staggering growth. Her ultimate success was not in the act of destroying him, but in her profound ability to rebuild herself into something stronger in the space he once occupied. She reached out and lightly traced the frame of the painting. The summit, she had learned, was not a destination. It was a vantage point. And from here, the view of the future she was building was magnificent and endless. The story of Genevieve Beaumont and Nathaniel Caldwell is a brutal lesson in power arrogance and the silent strength of those who are underestimated. It's a reminder that in the world of high-stakes business and life, loyalty is not just a virtue, it's a currency. When that currency is devalued through public betrayal, the consequences can be swift, total, and unforgiving. Genevieve didn't just get revenge. She performed a corporate amputation, saving the empire by cutting away the limb that threatened to infect it. She proved that the most powerful move isn't always the loudest one in the room, but the one that is planned in silence and executed with absolute precision. If this story of cold justice and calculated revenge resonated with you, and you want to hear more tales of ambition, betrayal, and the ultimate price of power, then make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story of strength, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming next.